The Honourable Keith Hodgson.
Chairman, I want to speak straightforwardly and uncomplicatedly in favour of Clause 8 and will say why shortly. But before I do, I just want to refer back, with your permission, Mr Chairman, to some remarks made by Catherine Delahunty in the previous clause, in which she said of the people who had come to the Select Committee on this legislation that she had found them, and I think I've got her words correctly, fiercely eccentric. And that's a lovely poetic description of scientists when they're being scientists, you know. And I commend the member for that description. It seems to me to be a cracker. We've now got, so long as this clause makes its way into law, we've now got, as the member in the chair points out, the opportunity for a person who is primarily interested in humanities to be involved in picking up prizes which are big in the range of prizes that exist for scholarship in general. And those prizes are inevitably administered by the Royal Society. Who else would administer them? And so the member in the chair points out that we might see a person pick up the Rutherford Medal, for example, who's got a humanities background. Here's the thing. It is entirely possible, actually I would assert it is likely, that a person who picks up the Rutherford Medal for humanities may well also be a scientist. Because, in my experience, which is not vast or anything, people who've got brains way bigger than mine will move quickly and easily across endless disciplines. They just get comfortable with themselves, comfortable with their ability to think, and they don't sort of see boundaries. They don't see limitations. I don't want to name drop particularly, but I went offshore with Dr. Alan McDiarmid in about 2000 and something. And we went to China and to Korea and to Japan. And his job was to open the scientists' doors and get into the Chinese Academy of Science or the Japanese Academy of Science or whatever. My job was to open the government doors, and we had 20 or 30 science managers with us. And I think it was a successful trip. I hope it was. It was certainly well planned, and certainly Dr. McDiarmid, who was only a few years away, he was nearing the end of his life, he put in a huge amount of energy. He was an amazingly energetic man. But he was also, in a way, fiercely eccentric. And he would just wander off, almost into hyperspace. I couldn't keep up with him particularly. And certainly move away from, all of the, the chemistry that he got his Nobel Prize in many years ago. He was miles away from that. He was entirely philosophical about any issue that came to mind. And so it seems within the bounds of possibility that such a person might, who receives the medal that the member speaks of, might in fact be moving from one discipline across into another and back again freely. Actually, it raises another matter, and that is the link between the sciences on the one hand and the humanities on the other. We've got some classic examples where we know that science and humanities interact. The interaction of humanities in the Antarctic would be an example. We've got writers and poets, as well as, of course, photographers, who give us an insight into that environment, given that most of us are never going to be allowed to go there. Because scientists are allowed to go and non-scientists are not, unless they are the occasional writer or poet or photographer. So that's an example. When I first became Minister of Science, the Morse people ran a thing called Smash Palace, in which they put scientists and artists together for the day or for 2 days or whatever, and they had to do problem solving, and they had to then explore how each other's mind worked. Like, solving the problem was the given issue, actually working out the difference in the way that, either you call it the left brain, right brain, I don't know, that the link between the two voids, the two sort of big lumps of science and art was explored. And then, of course, and I think other people have made mention of it, but we now have some sciences that need the arts. The real favourite, Mr Chairman, the real favourite science, everybody's real favourite science these days is neuroscience. Used not to be. 10 years ago it was forensic science. But hey, we've got a new fashion. It's neuroscience. And neuroscience doesn't make good progress unless the arts are involved. It doesn't make a lot of sense unless we take a bit of behaviouralism and fold it in. And behaviour is, of course, very often an expression of culture. Economics, which would love to be a science but hasn't got enough, a dismal science, some people call it. I don't think it's got enough body of knowledge to be a science yet. Certainly in microeconomics they have, but not in macro, in my view. The behavioural economics developments that are occurring now as the result of neuroscience are pretty interesting. And I've had the opportunity to study them in the last year or two. I do understand that some members of the House may not want to, but I have, and I've enjoyed it and found it reasonably interesting. But they've come about because science and the humanities have been required to collide, and the collision is reasonably productive. It's reasonably productive. So I don't think that the Royal Society legislation that we've got in front of us and the Clause 8 contribution, which says that someone who has got a humanities background might be involved in picking up a prize, I don't think that's the limit of what we're about to get up to tonight. I think what we're doing is that we're offering some sort of, legislative can-do to the idea of that collision between the arts and the science. And I do hope that, especially in economics, it makes progress, because economics as a discipline needs to make some progress. Mr Chairman, if you'll indulge me, I've just finished reading this book. It's by a guy called Lloyd Gearing. The title is Christianity Without God. I thought he was found not to be such. I could be wrong, but, in 1966 I thought the decision was not a heretic, but, if the member wants to correct my history, he's welcome. I wasn't about to get into that. I was about to draw this thread that the good professor says that we are encouraged by no less an authority than the Bible to believe that we have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all of the earth, and that he asserts, does Lloyd Gearing, that in other words, biblical theism encouraged us to exploit the earth. Then goes on to say, in earlier times, when we were not being monotheist, when we were dealing with many gods, we were much more aware than we are now, and I quote again, that their continued existence on earth was dependent on the forces of nature. That's why they, our ancestors, personified and deified these forces and tried to placate them. That is why they believed their own destiny to be in the lap of the gods, the most important of whom was Mother Earth. All I'm saying there is that humanities collided with environmentalism and therefore with environmental science. Am I right? And I don't want to make a big deal of that, but that's what a big brain can do, and I can't do that. But that's what a big brain such as Lloyd Gearing's got can do. And it seems to me to be not a bad example in a book that I finished reading a couple of days ago of where that collision between arts and the humanities, humanities and science might lead us. There's another thing to be said, and then I'll stop saying anything. The other thing to say is that the opposite, ignoring the role of humanities as a scientist or of science as a humanities student, is just a form of chauvinism. It is not tolerable. It is not useful. It's something that we shouldn't put up with, and it's the reason why we should, I hope rapidly, pass into law Clause 8, which has got science and technology and humanities on an equal footing for the first time in our legislative history.
Mr Chair.
To Chris Farford.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. It's an honour and a pleasure to be